As economic globalization, the World Wide Web, and advances in communication technology pull the world closer together, the West and the rich world has become ever more centered on the goal of ending worldwide poverty for good. A combination of ethicists, economists, and business leaders have pushed the envelope in making destitution, food insecurity, and death from preventable disease literally a thing of the past. The thing is, we should all want to end poverty. Even if we ourselves are not altruistic people, ending poverty benefits us all. Aristotle said that poverty produces factious conflict and crime. Looking at the developing world today, we see economic destitution spilling over into violence and suffering on a systemic level. Many development thinkers have told us that the best way to end worldwide poverty is to give the poor the tools they need to make their own aid. Nobel Prize-winning economist Muhammad Yunus, through his pioneering work in microfinance, has shown us that the global poor are entrepreneurs, that they can make and use capital to effectively grow a business. Another development philosopher who has been instrumental in this project is Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, whose years of research have shown us that the assets held informally by the poor globally total nearly $9 trillion. These assets are their homes, businesses, and other forms of property that are kept from being fully legally recognized in their respective countries. What De Soto has shown us is that the capital the poor already hold is far in excess of what we can deliver to them through aid. The question with respect to development thought has truly began to turn to, how can we create the tools for the poor that make aid unnecessary? An investigation into the fascinating ways in which blockchain technology is being incorporated into the establishment of clear legal property rights for the global poor has uncovered one strategy that is making that happen. So here's what I found. Hernando de Soto began circling his own development theory around the early 2000s. De Soto began his work by arguing that the position of economic primacy over the rest of the world that the West has held, from arguably the 16th century all the way to the present, was not some coincidence. Rather, the West had long had a well-established, legally backed system of property rights that made their economies work better than others, while in the rest of the world, corrupt governments and predatory parties made free commerce and economic development risky and expensive. The West, primarily countries in Western Europe and America after the 18th century, plowed forward with modern economies driven by well-organized marketplaces. De Soto researched and ultimately concluded that the single most important factor in an economy is the availability of credit to, say, start a business, buy an asset, or invest in development. Property rights are integral in the formation of a credit market because before any loan can be guaranteed, the loanee must put up something called collateral, or a piece of their own property that the loan giver can confiscate should the loanee fail to make all of his payments. What De Soto has shown us is that in much of the developing world, the poor lack the formal recognition of their property that allows them to use their homes, businesses, and other property as collateral to obtain a loan and grow their wealth. To quote De Soto's book, The Mystery of Capital, the poor of the world, 5/6 of humanity, have things, but they lack the process to represent their property and create capital. They have houses but not titles, lands but not deeds, businesses but not statuses of incorporation. In the United States, every homeowner has a legal document they can produce at any time to prove their house is theirs. Should anyone simply seize their property, they would be protected under the law. De Soto shows us how the inability of homeowners in a country like Bangladesh or Somalia to produce the same kind of document has kept the poor world poor. Without property rights, exchange between two parties is impossible because they can only make agreements through trust and word of mouth. Common people are excluded from the worldwide economy because they are trapped by an inability to formally capitalize their assets. Given how well De Soto and other development thinkers have documented this problem, Western aid agencies, NGOs, and even governments have poured aid into the developing world to help them create their own formal property recognition systems. From Central and South America to the Asian subcontinent to Africa, billions have been spent by aid agencies in the last decade. To this point, agencies have an adopted approach of working directly with governments of respective countries that lack property titling mechanisms and giving financial resources to better improve existing bureaucracies and titling techniques. Two fellows at the Cato Institute, Clayton and Peter Schaefer, have worked extensively over past years to highlight the many flaws in the existing approach of working directly with governments. The Schaefers have found that while traditional attempts have been both costly and implemented on a large scale, they have been unsuccessful at increasing global property enfranchisement. The problem, they argue, lies in the top-down approach. Western aid agencies operate on the assumption that existing elites and bureaucrats want to enfranchise the property of the lower classes in their society. But the truth is that many do not. States intentionally use outdated technologies to file land titling claims and rely on highly paid, highly corrupt, and highly unresponsive land inspectors. They require title claimants to comply with complex and costly regulation. An investigation into one registry office in Zimbabwe in 2008 showed 3 inspectors and a backup of 1,500 claims. Globally, it is estimated on average 25% of a property's value can be eaten up by the cost to formalize it. This incentivizes smallholders to keep their assets as informal, which is an intended result. Governments in the developing world engage in these practices because having a title of citizenry gives them enormous legal power. In 2013, the World Bank found that 50% of the population of Kabul, Afghanistan was under eviction notice. Preventing full land rights has been a crutch of unstable states struggling to keep tabs on their citizens in an increasingly globalized world. The failures have been costly and represent the ineffectiveness of trusting society's elites to willingly hand over so much economic agency to their underclasses. In Latin America, over $2.8 billion was spent on land management programs between 1994 and 2004. The Inter-American Development Bank, however, estimates that 92% of businesses, 76% of rural properties, and 65% of dwellings in 12 surveyed countries in the region remain extra-legal or informal. In Jamaica, through the aid of NGOs, the government agreed to enter into a good faith property titling overhaul. The Inter-American Development Bank funded installment of new computer systems at the country's National Land Agency, which were purchased through aid. Yet years after this program, the large number of informal properties in the country has not decreased. A report in June of 2014 shows that one section of the country, called St. Elizabeth Parish, has not reduced its level of 32% informality since the LAMP program began in 2000. As Mr. Schaefer wrote in December of 2014, valuable assets are frozen in legal limbo, and globally trillions of dollars in savings are rendered illiquid. It is clear that in case studies of its use, the method of going to the government first to secure crucial property rights for the poor is not viable. It should have been considered, before so many billions were spent, that those in power rarely willingly give such a silver bullet to the masses. The battle for property rights has not lost momentum for all these failures, however. A new group of thinkers and agencies have learned from the mistakes of the past and put faith in the notion that when the poor are denied the right to do something, they can use the power of collective action and cooperation to circumvent bureaucracy and elites. Researchers Claudia Williamson and Carrie Careques are focusing on a bottom-up approach, which seeks to first establish the charting and recognition of individual smallholders' assets among small communities, and then later allowing the law to recognize systems of land titles that already exist. The bottom-up land titling approach follows a process wherein claims are made by individuals, verified by those affected, aggregated by the community, and then brought to the legal authority. History gives us countless examples of when this method has been successful, including the American West in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the American West, land titles were created by squatters and later recognized by the U.S. government. The Distributive Preemption Act of 1841, passed by the 27th Congress, gave squatters a preemptive right of purchase for a nominal fee before the lands they had squatted on were entered for sale on a larger market. This allowed for a natural process of squatting, community recognition, and investment. Farmers formed clubs and civil society organizations in the absence of an effective government. DeSoto notes how strategic this was for economic growth, writing in The Mystery of Capital that the U.S. economy was fueled by capital investments in housing, industry, railroads, and ranching, all of which depend on secure property rights. Bringing the poor the tools to repeat the lessons of the American West is a far better alternative for securing their economic progress. Right now, in countries with archaic land registries, economic growth is stymied by property rights in conflict. When foreign multinational companies, hoping to invest in developing communities, look to purchase land, they are often dealing with the government directly. They often arrive to find squatters on land that was marked as uninhabited, and they then work with the government to evict or displace them. Formalization can give greater agency to these squatters to negotiate with companies directly, and end a cycle of poverty seizures in a system that is not acting in their interest. What's more about this bottom-up approach is the widespread consensus among development thinkers that community-based registries should be online and digitally based, in a software that self-validates, tracks change over time, and even submits claims for government approval if a sound legal system is in place to verify. Online registries can be available to anyone with internet connection across the world. They can offer protection against uncompensated takings, and what's even more, they can make long invisible assets finally visible to the global economy and create a money market for land investment in the long term. And here's where we arrive back at the blockchain. The technology has become a major key for property rights advocates. Fernando de Soto has not been on the sidelines in this fight since he released his influential theories in the early 2000s. He has in recent years become one of the biggest proponents of blockchain application and the creation of land registries for the world's poor. Its user-monitored digital registry is the kind of tool that allows the poor to circumvent unresponsive governments. Knowing this, since 2010, DeSoto's blockchain property rights project has been working globally, combining blockchain with its goals to bring economic agency through land rights. Most recently, DeSoto has been in Peru, where controversies over mining rights have stymied the country's economic development. This is best exemplified by two small farming communities in Peru, called Cajamarca and Lambayeque, which are both home to the richest Peruvian gold reserves. Chinese and American companies have sought to mine the area, but conflicts between the companies and local squatters, whose titles are not digitally or legally recognized, has made any project impossible. DeSoto's goal is to allow multinational mining companies to do business with households, farms, and indigenous communities free of conflict. Together with miners, he has led lobbying efforts to plug Peru's poorly designed, age-old artisanal chain into a blockchain model registry, as was seen with the successful DeSoto-led effort to plug the land titles of Juliaca, Peru. Blockchain can legitimize the interests of both indigenous entrepreneurs and smallholders and transnational conglomerates to mutual benefit. Efforts by DeSoto in Peru and others across the world are on the cutting edge of technology-savvy development theory. In 2015, Sir Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Group, held a global blockchain summit on his private island in the Caribbean. With DeSoto moderating the convention, he spoke to leaders of the tech industry saying, "The challenge we face is to legally identify the chains of extra-legal conventions that give the majority of the world's population control over wide swaths of territory and resources, but none of the legal devices required to develop them by entering into fruitful agreements with those who have that capability." A strong consensus was reached that blockchain systems can unleash a swarm of foreign investment to the developing world. The momentum of implementing DeSoto's ideas globally has been growing steadily, most recently with an exciting development in Honduras. Honduras is a country with nearly 60% of its land undocumented, and an antiquated artisanal land registry that has allowed bureaucrats to oversee land seizures for their personal use with a total lack of accountability. Under foreign pressure, Honduras's Property Institute has entered into a contract with a Texas-based company called Factom to build a digital registry for the country using blockchain technology. With the help of another Texas-based company called Epigraph, in the coming years, Honduras will switch over to a system with the self-verification features of blockchain. Economic growth will surely follow. It is important to examine the ethical implications of these efforts at land titling for the global poor. As was clearly demonstrated, elites in society, or those that control the majority of the property, resist the enfranchisement of property rights to all because of the acknowledgement that it could detract from their own wealth. These elites are operating according to a principle known as scarcity, which was explored by Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. Scarcity states that there is not an unlimited amount of economic resources, and that this existence of a finite amount of wealth drives a societal concern for economic efficiency. The existence of scarcity is undeniable, and it is true that it drives rights in conflict within economic systems. Now, to simply look no further at the principle of scarcity, the argument could be made that the elites this project has examined are acting merely out of a pragmatic recognition of their own interest in controlling the maximum amount of resources possible. Yet such an argument would ignore the full picture of a just system of property rights as defined by Locke and other thinkers who value property, and the just exchange of property by fair means. There are limitations on the scarcity principle, including what's called the enough is good principle. Because there are not an unlimited amount of resources, an individual must leave enough for others. One's pursuit of resources cannot violate another's right to ownership of their own labor. Locke proposed the labor theory of property ownership, which stated that each person owns his body as well as the scarce goods which he puts to use with the help of his body. When one mixes their own labor in with physical property, that is what makes it truly theirs. Ownership of property implies the right of the owner to use his goods as he sees fit, but only so long as that use does not violate the personal property or control over property of another. Many of the global poor that this project has examined in both the Economist articles and this video have had their own ownership rights violated and been denied their right to determine their own economic future. I believe property rights are the engine of a productive and free society. The reason it is important to protect property rights is because they are the surest way to achieve economic growth and an abundance of resources so that all can stand to benefit from these resources. The reason why individual, rather than collective ownership of property, drives more productive people is because human beings respond to incentives. Property is, after all, only a physical object that is assigned a monetary value in a marketplace. As Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote in his book, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, the provision that only the physical integrity of property, not property values, be protected guarantees that every owner will undertake the greatest possible value-productive efforts, including efforts to promote favorable changes in property values, and to prevent or counter any unfavorable changes in property. In this theory, the best way to lift more people out of poverty would be to foster the growth that is associated with individual ownership and economic endeavor. That is why this fight is so important and just. Blockchain is, as I have identified, a crucial tool in this fight. Thinkers like De Soto really are, when examined in a larger ethical context, are those that have an altruistic spirit to see the end of poverty, have investigated the nature of how property is exchanged in countries with large amounts of poor. They have found a lack of basic rights to own the property that one's labor produces because elites have listened only to the portion of the scarcity principle that tells them to accumulate, and not to the principle that demands the integrity of the system be maintained. As a result of the violation of the right to their own property, the global poor have been denied the right to participate in a system of free exchange that would see their labor translate to more ownership of a finite number of goods. The goods, or wealth, are being hoarded by those that control the political and legal mechanizations of the state. As the United Nations and other international coalitions look to eradicate poverty, they should pay more attention to these truths. All people want to innovate, collaborate, and achieve economic security for themselves and their families. The crucial next step in eradicating poverty is opening avenues that have long been closed, and finally giving the poor the tools to shape their own future.